You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics. National speaker Timmerie Millington has been a passionate advocate for life as long as she can remember, helping Gen X through Z answer the call to true feminism and authentic manhood. Timmerie holds a master's degree in biblical theology, and she covers this week's hottest stories from a Catholic worldview. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
And we are back with Father Tim Grumbach in studio with us, the associate pastor at St. Augustine Parish, and a regular guest here, giving up his one day off a week to come and spend it here in studio with Trending.
This is the best way to spend the day off. Right?
Always talking about fun topics in here. We're going to be discussing this actually alarming trend that has come out that essentially for the last 3 years, there's been a decline in life expectancy among the younger people only in the United States after years of trends of historical patterns showing that we were having longer life expectancies than before. So we'll come to that in just a bit. We'll also be talking about infertility, surrogacy, kind of the tie-in with eugenics. So don't go away. We have a lot packed into today's show. Father Tim, also, we're going to be talking about this new story that came out about how the title claims that this lesbian couple is the first to carry a baby in both their wombs. It came out from the Telegraph, so we'll be talking about that at the end of the show, so be sure not to miss it.
Yeah, we're so excited to be looking at the quantity of life, right? But really, we're so excited even more to talk about the quality of life and the gift that God has given to us in life, created in the image and the likeness of God. And so there's so much we have to say about that today.
Amen to that. So let's start about this trend. I mean, it's just so surprising in some ways, because I remember growing up, people are saying, man, people are living longer than they ever did before. Life expectancy is going up, especially for women. Men tend to die a little more often and sometimes more violent ways. But now we've seen this reversal of a historical pattern. In fact, for 3 consecutive years, Father Tim, you sent this over to me, people aged 25 to 64. You're supposed to be in your prime in these years. Your career's booming. Maybe you're heading into retirement at this point. And yet this is where we're seeing many people are dying, and even more so among the age 25 to 34.
Yeah, it's easy to kind of laugh about it a little bit and say, well, good, I've made it past that limit. But it's a really alarming trend. And one of the first things that a lot of the reporting is looking at is trying to find out the reasons for this. But I'm really convinced that they're still looking more so at the symptoms rather than at what the underlying root cause of shorter lifespans are. And they're able to point out a few different things in this article. One of these is the opioid crisis,
yes,
which is a serious thing that we're looking at in all parts of the world. We can see these things. I can say, see it sometimes in my own parish, to see it in the streets right outside of our parish, and it's coming into the church buildings. And so this is something that's happening in families and in friendships, and this is not just statistics. This is what's happening in our families and in our streets and in our lives.
And I think the question always is, why the opioid crisis? Why the other causes? I mean, one of the big things they talk about as well is obesity, and how we're seeing that men on average weigh 30 pounds more than they used to, and also that almost 20% of children aged 2 to 19 are obese. We're also seeing that women are dying of diseases that were more common to men, even things such as suicide, liver disease, and other issues. It's just showing across the board. And in fact, Ella Mira, who works at the Department Institute for Health and Policy Clinic Practice, she was commenting about how there's actually something more and really fundamental, essentially, to how people are feeling about themselves, feeling about, their futures as well. And essentially, it's leading them to be destructive in the way they interact with their day-to-day life and self-care, really.
Yeah, that word destructive is so key, is that when we see something as destructive as this, we want to know the reasons why.
Yeah.
And again, as we've already pointed out, that this article can look at, obesity, opioid crisis, other health trends that are on their way down. But what this really called to mind for me was something that I had heard mentioned by Archbishop Chaput over in Philadelphia this year after a couple of the terrible shootings that happened in our country. Earlier this year, there was El Paso, and then there was Gilroy. And in response to this, he called to mind what he had gone through as the bishop in Denver at the Columbine shooting, and his chance to be with families and not to try to fix anything, but just to be in the grief with them. And so he knows it firsthand, the kind of grief that comes when life is lost at such a young age. And he recognized that so much of the response from our nation is trying to figure out, how do we bandage these wounds? And they begin to look at not so much the root cause of it, but what are the symptoms? And he names a number of very important things that are systematically ruining these young lives. And he's looking at sexual anarchy, personal excess, political hatreds, intellectual dishonesty, and perverted freedoms. And that he says that these are something that we've created over the past half century or so, and they've become idols for us. Yeah. And until we cast those idols down, we're not going to be able to really fix any problems with. He actually advocates for gun control, and there's almost nothing you can say about that issue without being controversial. But he recognizes that gun control is not enough. It's just a bandage to put over these wounds, that we need to dig deeper. We need to find a deeper healing and to look at these things that are not being spoken of when violence happens in our nation.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. If you want to share this episode, or maybe you can't listen to the full episode, head over to radiotrending.com or your favorite podcasting app and be sure to subscribe. Father Tim, you talked about at the beginning of the show, ultimately, this respect for human life. And I really see at the heart of this decline in life expectancy, especially for people who should be in their prime, age 25 to 34. Essentially, what we're seeing is, I think it has a lot to do with the virtue of chastity, which it hits on the idea of self-respect, dignity, understanding that there's a value to my life and there's a value to another person's life. The life of a virtuous person understands that my whole life has been given to me as a gift. I am a gift. I am worthy to receive gifts from God. I have my Heavenly Father, and I too see value in the other people created. I see great dignity, that there's worth there, and there's something to respect just as a person, not just based on what you do. And I think that that's the difficulty, is when we lose a sense of chastity, kind of being faithful to our vocation as a child of God, whatever state in life we're in, we lose sight of holding to any sense of value in terms of how we eat, how we exercise, how we pray even.
And I love that you brought up this virtue of chastity as part of the thing that will heal at the root of this violence that we continue to see and this drop in life expectancy. And people will say, "Oh, that's the Catholic Church again, getting
about sex,
getting hung up on sex again." But the Catholic Church is the first to say that chastity isn't all about sex. It is about integrating our sexuality into our daily lives and recognizing. I love the language of the Catechism referring to chastity as a school of the gift of self. But it's also a matter of self-mastery that allows us to love not just from an expression of sexuality, but that expression of self-gift, of being made a gift to another person, not just giving gifts. We've got Christmas coming forward, and that's one of the most important things for a lot of people, is how to give the best gift, how to express my relationship based on what I can give to another person. And we forget that the more difficult but more important gift that we make is of ourselves. And so when we as a culture are no longer able to speak with that language, let alone live with that language, what John Paul II would call a language of the body in our sexuality, to tell the truth with our bodies in our sexuality, when we're no longer able to tell that truth, that we are created in the image and the likeness of God, but rather, fall into a culture of sexual perversion, then that is going to affect the way that we can simply love the people that are right in front of us. And then that will lead to a violence that may be very subtle at first, but then can desensitize us to greater and greater acts of violence.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, feel so empty, alone, unloved, all of these things. And this is what's so interesting about literally the light of Christ just exploding into the world once November 1st hits, because people love the Christmas lights. They love the happy songs. And why is that? Even if they don't realize it, it's the light of Christ literally radiating in their lives and recognizing that this world is a gift. I'm going to light it up at night and recognize it and sing about it. But sometimes we need to help people see this is why we're so excited to bring that light into the world at this time of the year.
Yeah, we're getting excited as a parish because we're getting closer and closer to finishing our capital campaign for the Archdiocese. And we were hoping to, kind of be on our last stages of, receiving pledges during these last couple of weeks. But, we've got some work to do. And it looks like it'll be more during the time of Epiphany when we celebrate that the Magi bringing their gifts to the child Jesus. And we're like, we got an easy preaching point right there. They brought gold. You can leave the frankincense and myrrh at home, but bring your gold to the church. But we're laughing about this, but we know as the priests given a pastoral responsibility over these people to call them to the great generosity that God has created our hearts for. And then that means, the Magi didn't just bring gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They brought the gifts of themselves, the gifts of themselves as Gentiles. They brought the world to the manger, to the one who made a gift of himself, so that we too can be gifts ourselves to the world. And when we forget that we were made as gifts to one another, that we belong to one another, Mother Teresa would say that's why there's suffering and war in the world.
I keep coming back to that quote you and I were just talking about on the show multiple times now, but again, just 2 weeks ago, of Fulton Sheen, right? And how he talks about how the world is full of half-crucified souls, souls who have come up off of the cross after an hour, after 2 hours, after 2 hours and 59 minutes. They weren't willing to go the distance. And this is the challenge as Catholics, to go the distance, to endure all for the glory of God, because he's already given us everything. And you guys, we've got to remember this. The goal isn't just this life here and now. We're called to live a good, virtuous life, but the goal is heaven. That is what we are orienting ourselves to. We'll be right back on Trending with Father Tim Grumbach. We'll be talking more about the theme of surrogacy and eugenics.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
I'm back with Father Tim Grumbach. First, a message from our underwriters here at Trending. Solidarity Health Share is simple to help pay for affordable, quality health care. They enable the community to share in each other's eligible medical expenses. You choose the doctors that you want to see. Even integrative and alternative medical treatments are eligible. Solidarity Health Share helps pay for NAPRO technology and costs associated with natural family planning. Solidarity Health Share is dedicated to both faith and your health care. Information is available at solidarityhealthshare.org. That's solidarityhealthshare.org. Speaking of health, we were talking about this decline in essentially the age of 25 to 64 are not living as long as they used to be. There are quite a few deaths taking place in that age range. But it reminded me of another story that I read that it was one of those trigger stories for me, Father Tim. And that was about these babies who are contracting sexually transmitted diseases, which I saw a lot happening in the crisis pregnancy centers when I was working there. But what we are not talking about is that babies are dying from these sexually transmitted diseases. Just in 2018 alone, there are 1,306 cases of newborn babies with syphilis from their moms.
Yeah, this is a major issue, especially even right here in California.
Yes.
And we see it with this rise in these diseases, but also we're seeing it as because of a result of drug use as well, with methamphetamines being a major contributing factor to the death of these children and really being born sick. And what I did notice about this article was what I saw just about the drop in life expectancy as well, is there's so much focus on what could be called the symptoms rather than what's the root cause of this. And so much of the effort is being put into, this is a failure of healthcare. And how do we pump more funding and more money into healthcare so that this can be resolved? And while that is a major step forward, is to create a healthcare system that can care for those who need it. But there's a major problem being ignored here, is what is the greater cultural sickness that is leading to this?
Absolutely. And I think that's what we were talking about in the last segment, the need for a greater respect for ourselves and others, understanding that everything we have from God is a gift. The theme of how Christmas is starting early because we start the day after Halloween now. We want that light of Christ going on in our lives, but we're losing perspective. And I hope that this story will wake you up if you're listening. Or maybe it's a story you can use to wake some other people up. You guys, looking at just 2018, from 2017 to 2018, there was a 40% rise of babies born with syphilis. Just in 2018, there were almost 80 babies that were stillborn as a result of contracting syphilis from their moms, and 16 died after birth. You guys, this is tragic. And here's the deal. These parents deserve better than giving birth to a dead baby, or a baby with syphilis, or a baby that dies not long after birth. And yes, we can point back and say that they made mistakes. They, were sexually promiscuous. We could go on and on. But the reality is that this is what our culture is breeding, a lack of respect for one another. And at a certain point, we've got to turn around and say, how am I contributing to this?
Yeah, and it's also pointing out that, especially among the homeless population, there are more and more women who are pregnant in the homeless population. And how do we care for these women, recognizing that, we can't put them back in the past and say, oh, you made this mistake and now you're stuck with this. That is the opposite of the Christian perspective. But I am seeing more and more of these beautiful small organizations create housing for women to care for them. Again, that's another one of the pro-choice arguments, is that, we pro-lifers don't care for the women. We only care for the unborn children, and that when the children are born, we leave them out in the cold. But what I'm seeing is these beautiful organizations that are creating housing for women so that they can be cared for if they're homeless, before and after the child is born, and to help them get back on their feet. So it's not just a matter of bandaging something up for a little while, but creating something where they can have a stronger foundation. I
know that you were recently at a dinner for one in Los Angeles, right?
Yeah, there's a beautiful home called Harvest Home,
right,
and the Archdiocese is actually somewhat partnering up with them to give them a new property as well, so they can almost triple how many rooms that they have available for the women who are homeless and pregnant. And the story goes further than that. They're helping them to create new lives, so that when they are out of Harvest Home itself, that they have their own homes and they can raise their children. And it's such a beautiful thing to see that we're not giving up when we're told that all we care about is unborn children, and that we don't care for the actual children that once they're born and for the mothers. And we will keep on saying it. We will love them both.
And this is something that we need to help people who are pro-abortion understand, because I am in dialogue all the time with people who they cannot even fathom that we would help them find a free place to live, that we would help them get a car. And I've said this over and over again, the crisis pregnancy centers, the maternity homes are there. The resources are almost unlimited. And I remember one woman looking at me and she's saying, but where does that money come from? Do they get government funding? And I kind of just laughed. Actually, a lot of the time they don't. I said, it's just a matter of requesting, whether it's to the church community or just the donors that support that center. People want to help. And I saw this firsthand. My parents opened up a crisis pregnancy center when I was a little girl. And when no one was able to, a maternity home. And when no one was able to kind of be the live-in parents for the maternity home for a period of time, my parents packed up our house and I lived there with my parents as they really mentored the young moms. And I saw miracles done in people's lives. I saw people coming out of poverty, terrible circumstances, children who were placed for adoption. I mean, this is the power of Christians who are willing to stay on that cross, as we talked about earlier, and make it to the end, to give the gift of life to other people.
Yeah, and to give that gift, it requires so much generosity. Yeah. That's definitely a word that's been on my heart a lot over the last couple of years, but especially this week, is this idea of generosity as being something more than just giving materially, but it has to start from being inside. There has to be something inside of us that recognizes the generosity that is God's very own life, and the generosity of the incarnation, the generosity of the miracles, the generosity of the preaching, and the passion, and the resurrection, and the ascension. It's all from a place where the generosity of God can't be contained in heaven or on earth. And to invite that into our own hearts. And it seems that the pro-choice argument would say, well, we need our government to be generous and pour all this money into allowing for safe access to abortions, without recognizing that we have a real handle in the pro-life movement on generosity, because it's not easy. It demands so much of us. And we're asking, the women who have these decisions to make, and the men in their lives to trust that a radical generosity that costs everything is who our God is, and that's how He pours His life into the world and continues to do so. And that it's a love and it's a generosity that has to start in us and be poured out. And we're going to need some government funding, but it has to begin with our desire to pour out what belongs to us and to be generous of heart.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Speaking of this overall, decline in life expectancy for people here in the United States, it made me think of the story that you sent over, Father Tim, of the conversion of the Pittsburgh Steelers rookie quarterback, Devlin Hodges. And just, man, I'm reading this story from the National Catholic Register about his conversion, and he is full of joy and hope and love, and he has complete peace in his life. It is incredible to see. That's what our culture is missing. And you can tell that his life has been radically transformed, that he is just bubbling over wanting to share about his conversion.
Yeah, you don't see this in the athletic world so much, especially in professional sports. And to read an interview from this young man, and he's going into like John 6 and the presence of Christ's body really and truly in the Eucharist, in the body and blood. And it's really powerful to see a young man who did not grow up Catholic, but had a conversion along with his family and was welcomed into the church, and how part of that Catholic conversion was inspired by another professional quarterback in the NFL, Philip Rivers, with the now Los Angeles Chargers. I keep wanting to say San Diego.
People are bitter in San Diego.
Yeah, right.
It's really killed the spirit of the sports season.
Yeah. But it's a beautiful thing to see in professional sports, that's the kind of inspiration that some young men are receiving, and that's why they want to become professional athletes. But also that's why they want to become Catholic. Is Philip Rivers also being from North Alabama and a Catholic, this inspired Hodges as a part of his own conversion. But there were some really amazing things. One thing is that Hodges really has become the starter for the Pittsburgh Steelers over the last few weeks. And it's on the heels of one of the most dramatic moments in the NFL this year was when the quarterback who was ahead of him was, some are saying, using the language, was attacked on the field. How could you be attacked on the football field? Well, he had his helmet ripped off of him, and the guy who ripped the helmet off of him hit him in the head with his own helmet.
Oh, wow.
This is the quarterback before Hodges. And it made national news, and some people were calling for this man to be prosecuted and everything like that. And so this is the situation that Hodges is stepping into, requiring leadership, and though many probably will not use this language, healing for the team, because it was a dramatic situation. Both sides made their mistakes. The quarterback before him probably deserved some kind of aggression towards him being on the football field, but nothing quite as dramatic as having his own helmet swung at him. And so for Hodges to step into the situation and to bring his faith into it as well, maybe not explicitly in the locker room, but on the field, to bring that kind of leadership that comes from his faith.
To bring who he is, though.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing. When we are a Christian, we're called to conversion of ourselves, but also to be a witness to others, to be the light of the world, right? To be that witness. And I'm sure without even mentioning his faith, something different is about him that he shows by how he interacts.
Yeah, and he knows his faith is affecting his field, because when interviewed about going to Mass before a game, he says that one of his linemen, Alejandro Villanueva, who's very Catholic as well, says, he protects me during the game, but that role actually starts in Mass with his prayers.
That part.
Yeah. An amazing witness to the faith, not just in the locker room, but on the field as well.
You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
Our favorite guest here on Trending, let's be honest, Father Tim Grumbach is with us. He is from St. Augustine Parish in Los Angeles. I hear some of our listeners have been making trips over to visit you there at St. Augustine.
Almost everywhere I go, I'm running into somebody who listens to Trending and really appreciates what's happening, not just when I'm on the show, but just the show in general. And it's, I had a young man mentioned something about it. I think he was visiting from New York or something like that and wanted to come by the parish. And so it's really humbling to know that this has that kind of reach.
I really ask you guys, please share Trending. You can join our mission and really support the work that we're doing by sharing about the show with other people. Maybe you send one episode. Maybe you go right now and make sure that you subscribe. You can head over to radiotrending.com, hit the subscribe page, and find out where we're at, whether you like Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, you name it. Please support our work and do not miss an episode. Again, you can head over to radiotrending.com. We're going to really tie in this theme of quote-unquote reproductive rights, which is essentially fertility, women's fertility. And I've got to start with this story that came out. Governor Tom Wolf of Pennsylvania, he has vetoed. And I'm just shocked. I'm kind of almost choking on my words here because he vetoed a bill, House Bill 321, which is the Down Syndrome Protection Act. You guys, before I even get into this, other countries are literally aborting babies who are diagnosed with a prenatal diagnosis almost up to 100% if they are diagnosed with Down syndrome. Here in the United States, we're almost at 70% of our babies with Down syndrome that are being aborted. And this bill, which passed again through the House and the Senate, would have ended up, the Assembly and the State Senate, it would have ended up becoming law. It would have created a protection. If a baby was diagnosed with a prenatal diagnosis, that baby would not allowed to be aborted because that would be eugenics. That would be selective abortions. Yet he vetoed this bill.
Yeah, we're being extremely casual with eugenics, aren't we, as a nation right now? I think I saw just another article recently, too, just a glimpse at it, showing that they're trying to, even on like a date matching sites, are offering the ability to match DNA with people so that you could have the perfect genetic child should you get married and have children. And somebody said we are being extremely casual with eugenics and not using that language, but we need to continue to use that language and to call it for what it is. And this is most unfortunate because I don't know how many of you know who have friends who have Down syndrome,
right?
Or friends who have children who have Down syndrome, is that they are some of the most beautiful people that we will ever meet, such genuine joy. And I have a friend who has very good friends who have Down syndrome, and he said, these people, in a sense, are living what heaven is going to be like now. Not to say that it's an easy life for them or for their families, but the joy with which they live, and almost this nonchalant, without a care sense of like, I don't care, I'm going to dance and sing right here. Isn't that what heaven's going to be like, in a sense? And
it's amazing to see some of the childlike joy that comes out of the men and women who experience Down syndrome and have literally dedicated their lives, have come out into the open and have become advocates for people with Down syndrome. I mean, who are we to judge and say that your life should not have taken place? Yeah.
What was it, just a year or two ago that Iceland came out and said, we have eradicated Down syndrome, and we had to be very clear, no, you've not eradicated Down syndrome. You have eradicated people with Down syndrome through the use of abortion. And it's, we can't call it anything else but eugenics.
Absolutely. And here's one piece that I really need people to hear me when I say this. Prenatal diagnoses are wrong all the time. All the time. I just want to repeat that. Prenatal diagnoses are wrong all of the time. And the problem is that they take that prenatal diagnosis that should be, if you decide to do it, helpful for if maybe it is something that's treatable in utero, some type of in utero surgery or treatment, or after the baby's born to prepare. But the problem is that people who receive prenatal diagnosis are being pressured to abort immediately if there's even some slight complication or even slight belief that there could be something wrong. I mean, this is what's so sad. And I see women all the time, friends, family, women in the crisis pregnancy centers who come in who have so much anxiety over getting these tests done when we should, if we decide to do them, which I think it's great, do it, but have the attitude of, I'm just thankful for the possibility of this information and to help prepare my heart for the gift of the life that's to come.
Yeah, and there's so many beautiful stories that I'm coming across in my ministry of mothers and their children who will say, the doctor tried to tell me to abort my child,
Yes.
or they're telling me, they tried to tell my mother to abort me, and here I am, very healthy. And while we know that that's not always the case, is that sometimes children are born with great disabilities that can be noticed before they're born. But we as Christians also have to be very vocal about this as eugenics, but also what are we doing as a people to support the parents when they receive a prenatal diagnosis like this? And are we there to help them as a family, to grow as a family? Are we there to help support them when they can't support themselves? So this is definitely more than just about naming eugenics what it is, but being a Christian society that they can say, like they did in the early church, there's something different about these Christians. They don't just expose their children. They don't share their wives with other people. Are they insane? No, we love. And that's what people need to start recognizing in us as more than just argumentative, but living the life that we promise.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. I just want to share a quick story. When I was working in the Crisis Pregnancy Center, I remember there's this woman, and I may have shared this before, who was looking to have an abortion, ended up choosing life, praise God, has her baby. And just within a couple weeks of having had the child and bringing the baby girl home, there was a fire that broke out within the house. And as the fire broke out in the house, the dogs were barking. The dogs, though, because the family had just brought home this new baby and were sleep deprived and exhausted, they'd ignored the dogs. And it was only the cry of that baby that they held as so valuable that alerted them to the smoke and the flames within the home. And the family was able to escape just in time as their home was engulfed in flames. And they carried that precious baby girl out. And it was incredible to me because I remember sitting, listening as the counselors were talking to this woman after sharing kind of this miraculous story. And they're talking about, like, this was the purpose in her life. She's so special. And, like, it caused them to love her even more. But I'm sitting there thinking, well, would she be less valuable if she hadn't woken them, if the fire hadn't broken out? No, we're human beings. We're not human doings. And I say this all the time, people laugh, but the reality is that just by the existence of her life, from the moment of her creation, she had great value. It didn't matter if she awoke the whole household to flames that would have burned down the house and the family. She has a value despite what she did.
It's another beautiful thing about being a Christian and recognizing everything that we have as a gift is that we may have something extremely dramatic like that happen, and it'll make so clear to us that that life is a gift,
right?
Or what we have in front of us is all gift, and even when we try to throw it away, but then something dramatic happens, and it's not making that thing more of a gift than it was before. It's just God allowing us to see that in our hearts, like, oh, this life is such a gift, and it's, and the giver is good.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
It makes us put into perspective, our arguments that we make for quality of life or, based on any type of mental illness or something that a child might have. No, our value is intrinsic to who we are, not what we do. Let's, Father Tim, talk about this life confirmation of Sarah Pitlyk. You're listening to Trending with the Timmerie. The Huffington Post put out this piece that you sent over, Father Tim, talking about how Sarah Pitlyk, a new life confirmation for a judge, this lady is anti-woman. She's anti-IVF and surrogacy. She doesn't want women to be happy. I mean, it just goes on and on. They're so upset because she's Catholic. She's even a counsel to the Thomas More Society that's doing incredible work legally. They're talking about how she has said that surrogacy and IVF is harmful to mothers and children. She talks about how it exploits women and commodifies children. And I mean, it's just incredible. She just nails it on the head, and they're so irate.
Right. And there's a senator from Illinois, Senator Tammy Duckworth, who herself has children from IVF, and she acknowledges this as something great in her life because she struggled with infertility for some time. But then she looks at Sarah Pitlyk and says, this is somebody that I couldn't trust if I walked into the courtroom, and there she was. And she says something very interesting and I think quite misleading, but maybe this is just how she understood it. And she says that Ms. Pitlyk mentioned that children conceived with the help of assisted reproductive technology are inferior. Mm-hmm. By looking at IVF and surrogacy and saying that this is actually getting in the way of what true motherhood and fatherhood are meant to be, that somehow the children are inferior. Now, I can't imagine that actually being her intent to say that the children are inferior, but this is what this senator heard. But now she's also representing this side as, those who are against IVF and against surrogacy think that children born from it are inferior. And we couldn't say we must say that couldn't be further from the truth.
It's not what we think. And
right.
I think it's the same argument when people try to say, oh, because I'm living in a gay relationship, you think my love's inferior. No, I don't think you're inferior. And a lot of people will reduce it to them. The reality is that just because something's wrong doesn't mean the person isn't valuable. And I think that's why it ties in well with earlier topic we were just talking about with Down syndrome. There's value to who you are. And this is what Sarah Pitlyk is confirming. And she's saying, this, in fact, when we are in favor of in vitro fertilization surrogacy, she talks about how it essentially weakens our attitude toward abortion and leads toward eugenics. And that's what's scary. You mentioned it earlier as well. People in IVF and surrogacy are selectively choosing which children they want to implant and which they either allow to be aborted or frozen. I mean, this is what's awful about it.
This commodification and industrialization of fertility is a very dangerous and slippery slope to begin to walk down. And praise God that we have judges now that can speak against that.
Amen.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
We're back. Father Tim Grumbach is in studio with us. We're talking about this theme of eugenics, which ties into a story we'll be talking about in a little bit about this lesbian couple who they claim is the first couple to carry a baby in both their wombs. Put a question mark at the end of that. Hold it there. We'll come right back to that in a second. Father Tim, someone recently asked me, she said, I believe in everything the church teaches. I am not okay with in vitro fertilization or surrogacy, but I'm seeing, young family members, girls who are deciding to sign up to be surrogates. How can I talk them out of this?
Part of it is this great desire for life and the culture's counterfeiting, almost manipulating of what that means of being able to be a mother and to be able to, in their sense, help those who are struggling with infertility, but doing so without the truth of human sexuality and the gift that God has given to us in it at the center of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to first recognize with in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, all of these issues combined together deal with some pretty tricky medical treatment. First of all, in vitro fertilization often is not successful, even in its first, second, or third round. Sometimes it's never successful. You guys, I run into people all the time at the coffee shop where, I talk about really controversial topics and somehow end up talking to my neighbor sitting at a table next to me. I have talked so many times to men and women. I recall specifically one gentleman talks about how he and his wife went through multiple rounds of in vitro fertilization. She has never been the same, both in terms of her health medically and in terms of her mental health. And just to cause the body to super ovulate, which the body's not meant to do. Usually a woman only releases one egg when she ovulates each month. And to cause her body to do that is something that the body was never meant to do. And they're causing the body to ovulate and produce 30, 40 eggs, maybe more or less at one time. This is incredibly harmful to the body, often causing permanent infertility down the road as well, and many other health risks.
And praise God that we're able to point to the physical risks that come with this, but we also have moral risks as well. And while we might not be able to speak that into certain elements of the culture, they don't want to listen to these rules that somehow we've put in place. But what we're really speaking into is the truth and the dignity of the human person. And so what are some of the moral issues that come up with IVF and with surrogacy? Well, one is that you have anonymous laboratory technicians suddenly putting these cells together. And so that is the foundation of this child's life, is that they've been somewhat created in a laboratory, in a sense. What else is there? There is reducing the parents to pretty much producers of cells, rather than letting an act of love be the creating element of this child.
An incubator. Reducing a woman to an incubator.
Right.
Women complain all the time about, this theme of being barefoot in the kitchen. Well, essentially, that's what we're doing. We're just paying people to do it now. That kind of sounds like a streetwalker to me.
Yeah. And another thing is, without getting too graphic, is honestly, with pornography and masturbation being an element of this laboratory process, that's something that is morally very troublesome, because it means that the child is not coming from the one flesh union between a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, even though that's not the case all the time, we admit, but for it to be actively the case, and that is how this comes about. That's something morally.
Yeah, and I know you're being delicate with your words, but I'm just going to be real clear if you don't get this, because it's important. You have to masturbate in order to produce the sperm. There are very rare cases where they will do it in other ways, in an act of regular sexual intercourse, to extract the sperm. But think about that. The man has to sit there and masturbate, either to be a donor, a sperm donor, or to try and conceive a life of his own. It's so sad. And in order to do that, they need to use pornography. I'm sorry I'm going there, but you need to understand how twisted the act of love has gone away from that act of love. We've turned so far away from it and convoluted it all.
And that is something that is a major issue throughout social media and other commentary right now, is the role of pornography in our culture.
Yeah.
And some will come up with very reasoned arguments against pornography, which is good to have those reasoned arguments. But part of me is thinking, that's just an idol we need to cast back down to hell. And why do we have to come up with arguments against it?
Amen. So we're walking through the process here. The next process is, then you have these babies, this new distinct human life that sometimes come about, right? But then those children are already more fragile, because usually the people involved have already been having infertility issues. So now we're playing with new babies and riskily moving them around in a laboratory, moving them around in one womb. In this case, we'll be talking a little later about maybe even from one womb to another. This is irresponsibility, essentially, because babies die along the way, because they rarely ever just implant one child at a time, because they want to see, well, how many will actually continue to live on? And then at that point, okay, you're pregnant with 4 children, or in the case of Octomom, 8. Octomom chose not to abort 7 of those babies. In the reality, most women end up aborting 2, 3, 4, 1 of those children. And sometimes the surrogate faces the challenge of, she's now carrying 2 or 3 children, and the person who's paying her to be the surrogate wants one of those babies aborted.
Right. And then what do we do with the embryonic children, the children that are conceived but then kept, usually frozen or sometimes even destroyed? And this is something that science will point to, is that these are new human lives, and our morality will take that even deeper. Is now what do we do with this? And honestly, this is a question that the church recognizes as almost an unsolvable dilemma.
Yeah.
Some people will say, well, to bring those children to term, let's find some surrogate mothers and bring these children into the world as developing human beings. But that the church recognizes as a very problematic solution.
There's no morally illicit solution. JP2 says essentially we cause such havoc and chaos in first creating life like this. There's no morally illicit way of getting out of this mess now, and it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and we also do have to speak a word of mercy and hope to those parents who have been through IVF and have raised children and are raising children, is that, yes, we're saying it now. These children are beloved children of God. They're not inferior to children born otherwise. And because I know some parents who have gone through IVF and are raising their children, and wonderful young men and women, but that it's still something that we have to speak into it, that love and that mercy, without coming off as we're condemning the action that you've done, and so we're condemning that child.
Yeah. I want to at least touch on one more point here. Why not surrogacy? Maybe you're doing this. Maybe you know someone who is trying to do this out of the goodness of their heart. They want to help someone who can't conceive a child. Or maybe that person is in dire financial need, and I think, well, at least I can do something good in the midst of getting some sort of financial gain. This is what you're contributing, though, in agreeing to becoming a surrogate. You're contributing to the increase of abortion. You're contributing to the increase, to be quite frank, in a contraceptive lifestyle that I can contracept until I suddenly decide I want to have children, and then oops, suddenly I have, issues with fertility. You're contributing to, the struggle of what surrogacy is, and you're contributing to the exploitation of women who are literally being taken advantage of every single day, who are being imported from other countries or who speak little English. You're taking advantage of the poor. Yeah,
and the element of sex trafficking and sex slavery comes into it in some countries as well. Maybe even in our own country.
Right.
And that aside, there's even the legal issues of what legal responsibility or authority do these mothers, these surrogate mothers have? Should they desire or see it as the best safety of the child for them to have some custody?
You guys, we could do a whole show on this. One other kind of element that we didn't even touch on is, what about those children who are now born through surrogacy, born through IVF? And we're hearing cases about this all the time, through 23andMe and all these cases where people suddenly find out, my father's not my father, my mother's not my mother. And it's shocking. And they want to know their parents. They want to know not just the surrogate, they want to know the sperm donor, they want to know the egg donor, and they want to know, the parents who have then raised them. I mean, we're at the point where people can have up to 5 different individuals involved in having participated in trying to create that life in that way. I mean, children are confused and heartbroken. And shouldn't we know that a fundamental part of who we are? Think about the culture of divorce and everything we've been through. We have a desire to know our parents, to be loved by our parents, and to see our parents happily together.
And that's a fundamental right of who we are as human beings, especially since we can use the language because God himself has given it to us, that his very relationship with us is parental.
Absolutely.
And it's not us projecting our parents onto God, but God projecting his life and his fatherhood into the life of our fathers and into the life of our mothers as well.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. With the last bit of time we have left, I want to talk about the story directly related. Story comes out, the Telegraph, that the first lesbian couple has come out to carry in both of their wombs, both the women's wombs, their baby. Now, it's interesting. It claims, and it's actually not clear, apparently one of the women, they harvested the egg from the woman, and it looks like she then took the egg for 18 hours before it being implanted in the woman who carried the baby to term. Now, it's not clear if they had inseminated the egg and that was a new distinct human life, or if they harvested the egg, knew they harvested it, and then put it back into her body before then implanting it and then creating new life and putting it in the other woman.
Either way, they're trying to create the best light possible through this situation. And one of them suggested that it brings you closer together rather than feeling one has a bond more than the other. And what strikes me most about this is that is built into parenthood, is that one has a bond greater than the other does. Is that in fatherhood, is that there is this lack of that bond that the mother has with child. And so that's built into nature. And now we are doing something that is not natural, that is trying to erase a bond that was created in a natural way for a mysterious and beautiful reason by our Creator. But also, it doesn't seem to be for the good of the child in any means. This seems to be, in a sense, for the mothers. They're claiming that they can both have this same relationship with this child, and it doesn't seem to be for the good of the child at all.
This has been Trending with Timmerie. To book her to speak or learn more about her guest, visit radiotrending.com. That's radiotrending.com. You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes.